I focus a lot in these videos on organizations and their employees. Now that I'm shooting the 14th video in this series, it's about time to pay attention to the self-employed, a class of employees in which the organization, the owner, the main operational core, all collides in one single individual. Self-employment is defined as a person who sells only her labor to a multiple of people, of organizations, and without any long-term contractual commitment to it. So it is a person who's not involved in production work. He or she sells services, her labor. Someone who has multiple organizations to whom she sells her services, and it is someone who is not for a very long time affiliated with a particular organization. This still is, and that's perhaps the biggest message of this video, a very broad class of people in a society. On the one hand, it refers to classes of jobs for which no contractual alternative exists. The writer, the novelist, the actor, the musician, they are generally self-employed, and they have been so ever since their profession exists. On the other hand, there are the owners of sole proprietorship, so the bookshop around the corner, the local butcher, the local bakery, which looks already entirely different from the musician and the novelist. There's people who are pushed from regular employment to sell their services to the company for which they used to work, but now as a self-employed person. Self-employed nurses or construction workers are the case in point. So the activities that these self-employed persons engage in differ widely from one to the other. Internationally, as we can see on this slide of OECD countries, there's also an enormous variation in the number of self-employed. As a fraction of the total workforce, they are a quite substantial component in Greece, in the Netherlands, and way less so in Scandinavian countries, for example. So if we look at this graph, we see a huge variety in self-employment over the OECD countries. We also see a huge variety in changes over the observation window, 2005 up to 2017, in changes in self-employment. So some countries, the Netherlands, for example, saw a sharp increase in the number of self-employed, whereas other countries, for example, Portugal, have experienced an enormous drop in self-employment. And already this graph masks a substantial underlying variety. In the Netherlands, self-employment is quite high, relatively speaking, and it is on the rise. It is on the rise particularly for medium and high-skilled employees who you might expect are able to look after themselves more than low-skilled employees. In Greece, the number is even higher, and it is particularly low-skilled employees who are older than 50 years who seek self-employment or are pushed into self-employment. Now, if you compare the high-skilled employee of the Netherlands who seeks self-employment from the older, low-skilled employee in Greece, you may well imagine that they face entirely different challenges. Scandinavia has a low prevalence of self-employment, but self-employment is to a large extent concentrated in low-skilled professions. Although in some countries, including perhaps Scandinavian countries, the prevalence of self-employment is relatively low, it may still constitute a separate section of society that struggles to make a living, seeing that self-employment in these countries concentrates on lower skilled professions. In Finland, we see yet another dynamic where self-employment is increasing in the population of male workers and decreasing in the population of female workers, hence widening a gender gap in self-employment in the country. So depending on the country you look at, merely looking at the level of self-employment is not enough. If you want to know the situation, the struggles that these self-employed face, you need to look into underlying skills levels, gender composition, age composition of the self-employed as compared to other populations. There are 4 reasons why, for business reasons at least, why we see an increase in self-employment over the recent years. One is lowering transaction costs. It is much easier to transact with people outside the organization since, in particular, the introduction of internet, of digital technologies. Finding a partner to transact with, negotiating with that partner, and checking whether that partner has done what you have agreed upon is much easier. With online platforms and online communication technologies, it has become much easier to identify the trading partner that you're looking for, to negotiate with that trading partner, and also to follow up on your agreements you've made with that trading partner. As a result, outsourcing something that as an organization you used to do yourself is easier now than it used to be a couple of decades ago. And hence, we see that businesses look for suppliers to components outside their own organization. Second, many processes in organizations have been standardized. Not in the last place because many software packages have become standardized. Hence, it is easier to coordinate across different organizations in a value chain. Now, these 2 reasons, lowering transaction costs and the standardization of business processes, make it easier for companies to work with others outside the organization. That explains why firms outsource more, but it does not necessarily explain why the parties to which outsourcing takes place are self-employed, so are very small organizations. And for that, we need reasons 3 and 4. The third reason is that technological solutions have become miniaturized. That is, we can fit more and more computing power in ever smaller devices. So whereas computing used to require huge mainframes or later desktop PCs, one can now essentially run a studio which shoots knowledge clips with only a camera or 2 and a laptop computer. So professions that used to require heavy computing devices, mainframe computers for example, can now be carried along in your backpack. So the miniaturization of technology made it possible for self-employed persons with limited budgets to have a lot of computing power at their hands. Finally, work in Western industrialized and rich democracies has changed from routine production work to non-routine knowledge-based work. And it is exactly that type of work in which the self-employed person specializes. Because of IT, it has hence become cheaper to transact with suppliers outside the organization, which is further enhanced by the standardization of business processes across these organizations. Outsourcing is then further favors small-scale entrepreneurs because of miniaturization of technology and the changing characteristic of work from routine work that is capital intensive to knowledge-based non-routine work favors further the case for the self-employed person. There are a couple of challenges in self-employment that warrant specific attention if you compare them to the employed population. First, as a self-employed person, the biggest advantage is also the biggest pitfall. You get to decide anything yourself. But that also implies that you have to decide on everything yourself. So also decisions where you couldn't be bothered, following up on sending out bills, doing your tax, filing your tax files, thinking of insurance, buying insurance products, thinking about life after retirement. These are also decisions that in organizations generally are taken care of by collective agreements, and as a self-employed person you would have to organize this yourself. Second, particularly for low-skilled self-employed persons, the market power of a self-employed person may be low. If as a high-skilled self-employed person you have a skill that is relatively unique, you may have some bargaining power over organizations. If you are that star architect, you may be able to land a job. But if you are a star construction worker, the power that you have over the organizations that would like to hire you is relatively limited, and that puts pressure on the fees that you're able to charge. That is, the construction worker who least considers decisions for his future, who doesn't save for retirement, who doesn't insure against health issues or unemployment, is likely to charge the lowest price in the market, and hence will be the most likely one to actually have a job. And the ones who look after their own decisions the most have a tough competitive position. In organizations, the effect of the business cycle is often dampened. So if sales drop a bit, then organizations are often able to retain some of their staff until sales increase again. But as a self-employed person, whenever times are rough, you have to be able to survive based on the savings that you have yourself. And if you're then in a market where your bargaining power is limited, saving will be tough. So the business cycle, the high and lows of the market are directly experienced by a self-employed person, whereas they may be dampened by the organization in the case of employment. So a self-employed person may be more at risk of burnout when the economy is doing really well, and it may be more at risk of poverty when the economy is down. Finally, but that is a bit beyond the realm of economics, society is more than the sum of individuals. And with the increase of self-employment comes an increase in people who need to look after their own business entirely by themselves. And that may deteriorate the quality of civic life, the quality of institutions. Some collective values that we uphold may become at risk when we all need to look after ourselves, particularly if this need to look after ourselves in the business context gets extended into civic and personal life.